I have my son every other weekend, the standard dad package. Well, I pick him up on a Friday from school, and then I drop him back in again the following Monday, so he spends all weekend with me. I call it the standard dad package because that is really the standard dad package that dads get. Not much of a role of a father. We don't have much space for that. But that's pretty much par for the course for many of us in this country. I'm going to tell you about something over this weekend. It was his school's summer fete this weekend, and my son on Friday said that he really wants to go to that. It's on Saturday, it was the next day, and he said, I really want to go to that, and I was like, yeah, fine, we can go along to that, no problem. My daughter, who I haven't seen for, I always say it's 2.5 years, but actually I think it's probably 3. I'd look at the dates and I'd work it all out. But I think, let's say 3 years. 3 years I haven't seen my daughter in any meaningful way. Parental alienation. So my son said he wanted to go to this school fete. He then assured me, he said, oh, mum and his sister are not going to be there, and they've said that they're not going because he said he'd like to go and dad will take me, so I was like, yeah, fine, we can do that. So it came around, it was Saturday lunchtime, and that it opened up, so we got there, we walked in, it was a school fete, they had lots of things going off, little games and little stalls where people were selling things. It was good. So we went along to that. Walked in, and immediately you kind of walk across, and my son said, oh, there's my sister. I'm very careful not to name names, but he said, there's my sister. And I looked up, and all I saw was a much taller girl. I don't remember, I haven't seen her for so long, and children change quick, and they grow. And I saw this figure just sprinting across the field to some tables, I don't know. I never looked at where she was going. I never looked at anybody who was there. I just carried on. I didn't want to be in that position anyway, but there I am. So then it turns out that what she's done is run straight over to her mum, and then her mum, oh yeah, bundle them out, whatever. So there is, get out, dad's there, you know what I mean? And you just think, well, there's no reason to be like that. I've given them no reason to be afraid of me, no reason to avoid me at all, but that's where it was. So that was, we never saw them again. So that would have been the end of my daughter's time at her school fete. Myself and my son, we stayed there, we were there all day. It was good. He was playing with some friends. It was a nice time, and we were there at the end. One of his friends, they were helping pack everything away, so he was running around in the school and playing. It was hard for me because my MS was a bit of a challenge on that day. You have good days and bad days, and I would say that day was a pretty harsh one. So that was how the school fete went, There was a sense of something for me in this. There was this, and it was weird because somebody had sent me a message as well, and I'd said where I was and what I was doing. I never do any of the YouTube stuff, and I try not to use my phone talking to people or texting people at a time when I've got with my son. That's a protected time for me and for my son. We have that time together. So I don't, I'm not one of these people that's always on it. But I got this text message through from someone who is also an alienated, targeted parent in parental alienation. Just a sociable thing, and I responded to him. And I said that I was at the school fete. My son was off playing with his friends, and I sent this guy a message to say where I was and how it was. From his experience, he said, how do you feel? Oh, God, it's horrible, isn't it? It's horrible to you just have this feeling, this sense of people thinking bad of you for no reason, and you just have this feeling of it. Any contact with the school, you get this vibe. You know, you pick up on this vibe that people think bad of you. This got me back to thinking of something from my early teenage years, end of my childhood, early teenage years. When I was in my upper school, I came from an area that had middle school still, so we had upper school, but it would be high school. I reckon I was aged about 14, something like that. There was this one day when I was at school, and the whole time when I was at school, well, let me tell you about the school. It was a bit of a rough school, and you know what I mean. There was a bit of trouble, definitely in the school. You had this back entrance out of the school. It was like a farm track, really. It was just like a dirt track, and you'd walk down past there, and everyone would all be walking that way, take you to the town bus station, and people would be getting on their buses to various different areas where they were living. And I remember, so we all tended to walk down that way. You didn't really go out of the main entrance. You walked down this dirt track. And often when you walk down, every so often you'd get a big crowd of people that would all be stood there, of other kids and, you know, teenagers and stuff. They'd all be stood there and they'd all be in a big ring. And as you walked past, you know, there'd be a fight going off in this ring. It'd be two people just like fighting, and the crowd would be around it, baying for it. It was a gladiatorial arena, this ring. And people would be, you know, baying for the blood, baying for the fight, and they'd all be scrapped, and these two people would be fighting in the middle. And that was the deal, you know. There was this one day when I was at school where I just got this vibe, this feel like that there was something amiss, and that I was being looked at differently, and people were talking in a different way. Do you know what I mean? And it was just an odd experience. End of the day comes, and I'm walking down this track with my friends, and here's this big circle of people, you know, a big circle of other kids that were there. And as I walked down, it began to open up, and I walked into the gladiatorial arena. And there I was. And there, waiting for me, was a lad who I'd known from middle school. And he'd come with me, you know, from the catchment area. He'd come with me into this school as well. He was someone that I knew, and we always just got on all right. You know, he was fine. I'd known him for years. And here I was in the middle. And here's this lad, which I'm not going to use his name. But here he was, throwing his blazer down on the ground, throwing his school bag on the ground. You know, here he is, come on, you know. And you realise that the reason everybody's been treating you different is because you were marked as one of the gladiators. You were marked as one of the people to put on the performance at the end of the day. And I walked into the middle of it, and there was this lad here. I'm going to call him Richard. It wasn't his name, but let's say Richard. And he was stood there, and I said, Richard, what's all this about? You know, why is this? The crowd is baying for it. You know, they're shouting for it. Come on. They're calling, you know, whatever they're shouting. But he was there, rolling up his sleeves, throwing his blazer down, throwing his bag down. You know, he's ready to rock and roll. And I was like, why are we doing this? I just walked up to him and said, I've known you for years. Why would I fight you? And I think it was something ridiculous, like, oh, because you've been saying this about my mum or whatever, you know. And I was like, no, I hadn't said that, Richard. You know, I've known you for so long. You know, why are we doing that? What are we going to achieve? I look back on that and think, I've made loads of mistakes in my life, but I look back on that and think, yeah, that was the right way of doing it. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want anything like that. I'm going to lose. I'm definitely going to lose. And I said all this. We walked out of there without, he put his arms around me, and we walked out of there as still friends. And that crowd around us was still, it was like they were going to hit us, really, because we weren't putting on that performance. I would have been 14, he would have been 14, 15. I look back on that, and I'm so pleased that that was the approach I took. Years and years later, when I'd moved away and I'd gone to a different area, you know, I did hear that that lad, Richard, he'd grown up, obviously we'd grown up into young men. He was killed on a motorbike, age 21. And I look back on that and I think I am so glad that I had that approach. Do you know what I mean? And we carried on being friends. We were never close friends. We were just friends, people who just knew each other. We were acquaintances. But I'm so pleased that I'm so very sorry he hasn't had a life. He's 21. That was the end of his life. But I'm so glad that I don't have on my shoulders. I have other things on my shoulders too. Sure. But I'm so glad I haven't got that on my shoulders. You never know what's coming down the line. But my reason for telling you this story is because that vibe that I got throughout that day at school, that people were in some way looking at you different and you're not sure. You're not really sure about what's happening. That is the experience when I take my son into school or pick my son up from school or go to the school fete, Anyone who deals with you, you get this kind of like a weird, and it's not to say it's like a paranoia that it's on me. It's like, no, absolutely, there is a false narrative. There's a false narrative that's being peddled, You've said this about my mum. That's what's going off. So when I walk into these places, I get that. If I go to parents' evening or school stuff, I've got that. I've got that feeling. I've got that feeling that in some way something's said about me and I'm not treated exactly as I am when I go out into the rest of the world, There's a false narrative that I carry with me on my back. I don't know the ins and outs of that false narrative. I know some of it, but I don't know the subtleties of it. So the fellow who sent me a text message saying, do you get this impression? It's like that he's describing there exactly what, when I was at school that day, that there was this underlying sense, a spider sense or something, where you're picking up and thinking something's not right here. Something doesn't feel right. Next thing you know, you're in the middle of a circle, people baying for blood, throwing their bag and blazer down. Because someone's told someone that you've said something about someone. Alienating parents need to grow up. But they won't. They won't ever. They'll never change. They'll never look and they'll never admit to themselves what it is that they're doing. And it goes on. It goes on and on. And you know what? You know the worst thing? I imagine my daughter was looking forward to that. Looking forward to her end of year school fete, summer fete. I know my son was, and we went along. And because of the brainwashing, because of the influence of her narcissistic borderline mother, she didn't get that experience. It was ruined. I wouldn't have been there. I wouldn't have been any problem. If she came up to me and said anything, I'd have been perfectly polite, of course. But it has changed something in me. I've been thinking about this for quite a bit, really. I did one of my videos, how long will I keep going? My scope, my patience for keep trying is running out. I don't know that there's a part of me just thinks, what should I do? I should probably just prioritize my son. My daughter has been brainwashed. She is suffering a psychological child abuse. Hopefully spelling it is not going to be flagged up by the algorithm. But she is suffering that because all these children that are suffering under parental alienation are suffering that. And I know that she's been brainwashed. But it's hard, isn't it? It's hard. The alienating parent will be suffering with some form of cluster B psychopathology. We all know one of the defining traits that we all know about, say, a psychopath or a sociopath, which I think are ultimately the same thing, and I'm only speaking at it as a layman who's read read things about this and who's researched it, you know, but I'm not a professional on this. But, you know, one of those defining characteristics of a psychopath is a lack of empathy. One of the things you will see in a child that is the subject of parental alienation is an absolute lack of empathy. No care for the damage that is being done to the targeted parent. And I look and go, oh yeah, but she's just being brainwashed. That's fair enough. I do think that. But then on the other side, I feel like I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that to someone. And what's happening is that cluster B personality, the narcissistic borderline of the alienating parent, the narcissistic borderline parent is, with their cluster B, lack of empathy, they're influencing your children too. They'll come out the same psychopath that their mother was, to some extent. That's about all from me. I'd like to thank you for your time. If you haven't already, please think about subscribing. If any of this is of value to you, I would really appreciate that, and you'd be very welcome into what is a small but growing community. Please leave your comments, anything that you've got to say, any experience that you've had which is similar to this. I read them all, I respond to them all, and I value them all. So like, subscribe, give me a thumbs up, comment, all of that jazz. And thank you for your time. And most of all, please look after yourself, and I'll see you soon.